Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we are meeting tonight, and I pay my respect to their elders past, present and future, and to the elders of other communities who may be here this evening. So my name is Julia Franco, and I'm the Biodiversity Officer at Nillumbik Shire Council. I'll be hosting tonight's presentation. And tonight we also have Dominic Bowd, who is the Waterways and Land Officer at Melbourne Water for the Nillumbik area. And we have Jason Wishart from Agriculture Victoria as well, who will be presenting tonight. So just a little bit of housekeeping. You should already be on mute and your camera is off, but if you aren't, can you please do that? And just to let you know as well, tonight's webinar will be recorded. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat function. There is a function down the bottom that's labelled chat, and I please ask the questions or comments be respectful as well. So during the presentation, please log your questions into the chat and we'll ask those questions at the end of the presentation. We may not get around to all of them, but we'll try our very best to do so. So welcome to our second webinar for this evening, which forms part of our Platypus celebration. Tonight's webinar is one of many that are part of Nillumbik celebrating our Platypus in the Diamond Creek event, which is a series of events that occurs across 2 weeks in May. And all events are being run by Nillumbik Shire Council in conjunction with Melbourne Water. We would like to express our thanks to Melbourne Water for the Livable Communities, Livable Waterways grant that we have received to allow this to happen. And along with tonight's webinar, we have a self-guided bike tour along the Diamond Creek, 2 more webinars related to platypus conservation, including discussing Victorian native fish species and water bugs. And finally, the festival will wrap up with a celebration day at Edendale Farm, which will include guest speakers, activities, music, and more. So please check out Nillumbik Shire Council's webpage for more details, and I'll also add a link into the chat as well. Tonight's webinar is on the impact of foxes and rabbits in Australia. So foxes and rabbits are widespread and abundant in Victoria, and the prevalence of these introduced pests does impact the platypus. The fox predates on the platypus, and rabbits damage wildlife corridors and creek banks by killing indigenous plants, creating erosion and places for weeds to flourish, impacting the water quality and water bug populations. Foxes and rabbits also cause serious impacts to the natural environment and agriculture, and they're potential vectors for disease. And successful fox control should also be strategic and implemented at a landscape scale in a coordinated fashion. So tonight, Jason Wishart from Agricultural Victoria is going to share his knowledge of fox and rabbit ecology, key control techniques, and the basic principles for effective management. So Jason has been involved in research and management of pest animals for over 15 years. He began his career at the Invasive Animals Cooperative Research Centre, where he assisted with the development of various pest animal management products and strategies, both nationally and internationally. He continued in this line of work at Animal Control Technologies for a relatively short time before joining Agriculture Victoria as a statewide specialist for established invasive species. Most of Jason's time now is spent educating and training key stakeholders on the importance of strategic pest animal management for agriculture and environmental protection. And so tonight, he will present the impacts of foxes and rabbits in Australia. Over to you, Jason.
Thanks, Julia. That was a good introduction. Now, would you like me to put my video camera on there or not worry about that while I go through the presentation?
Up to you. It might be nice for people to see your face.
Yeah, no worries. I'll share my screen. See if I can get that going. Video. No worries. All right, thanks very much. Yeah, so as Julie mentioned, today or tonight, I'll be running through some information on foxes and rabbits. Essentially, it'll be let me see my computer. There we go. Overview of the presentation is I'll talk a bit about their history, so how they got here, when they got here, that sort of thing, and a bit about the spread of foxes and rabbits across the country since that time. Also have a bit of an update on the Victorian status, so where they currently are and what their distribution and abundance is. Go talk about a bit about the biology and ecology. Those things are really important when designing a pest animal management program. It's really important to understand your pest, and to also understand the species that you're trying to protect as well. Talk a bit about the damages that foxes and rabbits cause at a broad scale, and then about the diseases a little bit. Run through each of the control techniques specifically, and then talk about management and monitoring and those sorts of things, and how to develop a pest animal management program. So the Australian history, both rabbits and foxes were introduced in the sort of around about the 1850s. Rabbits first, but then foxes fairly soon after. And they spread really quickly across the continent. Foxes pretty well mirrored rabbit distribution, and that's probably because rabbits are a major food source for foxes. And one of the things you'll notice, though, that they're not present in the top sort of tropical area of the country, and that's probably because where they're all from, so over in Europe and places like that, they don't really have those tropical regions, so they're not well adapted to live in that kind of environment. So everything sort of below or to the southern end of Northern Territory and Queensland, and even into WA, yeah, they're abundant and widespread essentially. So yeah, now both species are pretty well take up 75% of the Australian mainland. The rate of spread of rabbits was the fastest of any mammal in the world as well at the time. So yeah, I can't remember exactly how quick that was, but it was considerable, and that's largely to do with their reproductive potential, I suppose, which we'll talk about a little bit later on. And as with many of our pest animals, their spread has also been assisted by humans at the time. So for whatever reasons, people at that time would move rabbits or foxes around the place to establish new populations. And back then they were sought after as a meat, particularly the rabbits and foxes for their skins. So they were a bit of a resource as well. So the Victorian status, both foxes and rabbits are declared as established pest animals. So essentially, this means that they're abundant and widespread and not really able to be eradicated from the state entirely. There are areas potentially where they could be eradicated, or small populations could be eradicated if there were fences or if they were on islands. But yeah, as a general rule across the state, it's not possible with current technology. So then what we do in that space is to try and manage their impacts on particular assets. So we call it asset-based protection. And over here, we have a bit of a graph outlining the cost benefit of various stages of an introduction and where your money is best spent. So at the prevention stage, that's before the animal has entered the state. So that would be things like exotic species that aren't here yet. It's best to prevent them if you can before they ever get here, because your dollar or your return on your dollar, which is down here at the bottom, you can see one for 100 is much better off. But once you get to the established stage, your return on investment is not necessarily as great. So all the time we're trying to prevent, eradicate, or contain. But once they get widespread, then it turns to asset-based protection. So I'll talk a little bit about the biology and ecology of each of the different species, because like I mentioned earlier, it is critical for developing your management plan. So understanding their behavior and what some of the weaknesses are that can be targeted, I suppose, to make your management plan more effective. And, you know, when you're putting baits out or those sorts of things, you'll know when the right time is. So behavior for foxes, they're highly opportunistic and adaptive. So they'll eat a range of different things, and I'll talk about their diet a little bit later on. But they'll make the opportunities of anything that they find, so they'll scavenge and all sorts of things. They'll adapt their behavior too. So if there's a lot of hunting pressure, they'll become a little bit more nocturnal. But when it's cooler climate, they'll be out during the day a little bit as well. They cache food as well for later consumption. So caching is where the fox will kill more animals or more things than it's needed, and it'll bury it and save it for a later date when natural prey might be a little bit less abundant. And they know where those caches are, and they do keep an eye on them and protect them from other foxes. They have defined home ranges too. So some pests don't, but foxes do. So they'll protect their home range from other foxes. And they do this particularly if they have a home range that's highly valuable. They want to protect that and keep that in their family. They'll use dens as well. So foxes will dig dens, but they'll also use old rabbit warrens and dig them out, excavate them, or it could be even wombat holes as well. They breed once a year, and breeding generally occurs around about June, July, and most cubs are born in springtime, and they'll stay in the den for quite a while, sort of starting to emerge in probably early summertime, I suppose, to early to midsummer. Now, the average litter size is around about 4 animals, but they can have up to 10, which is quite a high rate of reproduction, and they're sexually mature at about 10 months old. So I mentioned earlier that foxes' diet, it varies, and they'll pretty much make the most of anything, but they're essentially an opportunistic predator and scavenger. They're primarily carnivorous, so they'll eat a whole range of different things, particularly they'll eat sheep, goats, all sorts of things, chickens and everything in an agricultural setting, but in the environmental setting, they'll eat small mammals, reptiles, amphibians, fish. They'll eat the eggs. So over here, we've got a couple of pictures taken from trail cameras that I've done over the years. And you can see in one of them, the top right corner is a fox with a baby kangaroo or a joey in its mouth. I've seen them in other camera images as well, trying to attack full-grown adult kangaroos. So they're not scared. They generally don't go for those sorts of things, but it is certainly possible. The image down below is one of a fox taking a malleefowl egg from a malleefowl mound, and I have quite a few images of that. Foxes will also eat vegetable matter and fruits and things as well. So they don't just eat meat, they will eat fruits and berries, and you'll sometimes see that in their scats that they would have eaten blackberries and rose hips and those sorts of things. A lot of the time they can also obtain most of their moisture from their food and don't necessarily need access to surface water, particularly in cooler environments as well. And prey generally start to wean, or they're weaned generally by about 4 weeks old and can eat live prey by that stage. So signs of foxes, whenever you're doing a program, it's important to know what's out there and how many and those sorts of things. And things to look for with a fox is dung. You'll often find that around perhaps a rabbit warren, or in the malleefowl situation, they were often on the top of the mound. So they would mark food sites and things like that with their dung. And you can see an image of that there. It's sort of a blackish color with tapered ends, and often within that they'll have fur and feathers and little bits of bone and those sorts of things. The fox track over there to the top right, it's a little bit different to a dog track because the front 2 pads are they're a bit more elongated, I guess you could say, than a dog track typically. So the front 2 pads are stretched a little bit further forwards. Scavenged carcasses is another thing that you'll often find if foxes have been around. So you'll find the remains of various animals, the den sites as well. And to be able to tell if it's a den, often you can sort of smell it, but otherwise there'll be another range of other things out the front. So fox tracks, old bones and those sorts of things. And fur caught on fences too, perhaps you'll find that. So where they've been going through the holes in the fences, you'll see fox fur caught. So they're just a couple of things to look for to confirm that you have foxes. So for rabbits, a little bit about rabbit behavior. Again, they're mostly nocturnal to crepuscular. So crepuscular is, I guess you could say, active on that dawn and dusk time period. above ground activity for rabbits generally peaks at about 9 p.m. So it starts early in the afternoon and gradually peaks and then starts to taper away until the morning. And if they don't get a lot of pressure, you'll see them out during the day as well. So when I say pressure, I mean hunting pressure and those sorts of things, or particularly if it's overcast days. So the warren certainly increases the survival and breeding success of rabbits. And activity is centered around the warren. So generally when food is plentiful, they'll only travel about 300 meters or so from the warren, but as things dry out and food becomes a bit more scarce, they'll travel as far as a 1.5 kilometers away. Breeding with rabbits is triggered by availability of green food generally. So around sort of winter time, or autumn winter is when they start to breed. So after the summer, after we get a bit of a break in the weather, and they can breed all year round if the conditions are right. So if we're getting a fairly wet summer, they'll breed throughout the summer as well. Rabbits are sexually mature about 3 to 4 months of age. Gestation is about a month, and they can have 2 to 12 kittens per litter, and they can have 4 to 7 litters per year. So you can see that they can explode, their populations can explode pretty quickly. So the diagram to the below right hand side of the page, it's an example of a study that happened in Canberra. It was in a pen situation. So they had two rabbits in a pen. They were left in a pen that had a warren system and everything in it. And after 18 months, those 2 rabbits had turned into 184 rabbits. So you can quickly see how rabbit populations can recover after control, or even when you only have a few, if the conditions become right, that they can really pick up quite quickly. So rabbit diet, they're an opportunistic herbivore. They mostly like to feed on the green grass when it's available, and they'll primarily eat crops and pastures and native vegetation. But they'll also, when times are tough, they'll eat bark and leaves and seed pods and roots. They require a high quality diet for reproduction, and particularly protein. So they want about 15% protein in their diet for successful reproduction. They'll also produce cecotrophs, which is what they refer to as soft feces, which is feces that rabbits will eat again. So it'll pass through the digestive system once, and then they'll go and eat that again and get the absolute maximum of nutrients from their food that way, because they've only got a single stomach, unlike sheep and other species. And the other thing too is rabbits can survive without surface water, so they can survive by getting a lot of their moisture from their food. Signs of rabbits, probably all seen these buck heaps or dung heaps around. So that's where mostly the bucks will deposit their dung and urine and mark scent on those areas, and you'll see them around near warren systems. You'll also see tracks around in the sand if there's any sand around, or in some of the excavated dirt that's come out of the warren system. You'll see warren scratchings as well. It's another common thing to see. A lot of these things you'll see before you see the rabbits as well. So it's just to confirm that they're in the area. Ring barking's another thing that happens, but generally that happens when other feed is scarce. So they'll start to ring bark and get their nutrients from that. Browse lines as well. You'll see in the bottom right-hand corner, that photo there. You can see where the rabbits have been standing up on their hind legs to get as much of that feed as they possibly can, and they'll leave that browse line there. They also leave these secateur-like cuts in vegetation. So if you're looking around, you'll see seedlings that have been nipped off, and often you can tell that it's rabbits by those cuts that they leave. And yeah, just grazed areas. So it'll end up looking like lawn almost. So you can see there with that box thorn where the rabbits have sort of been grazing around that periphery, and yeah, ultimately change the vegetation there. So a lot of the time they'll graze that right down, and the first thing that comes back when there's any rain is things like cape weed and other sorts of weeds. So the impacts, I've combined the impacts for the different species rather than focusing on them each separately, just to shorten the presentation a little bit. So for foxes, preying on native wildlife and their eggs is probably the biggest issue that we have. So that's the eggs of turtles, malleefowl, as I mentioned earlier, but preying directly on wildlife as well, from anything from small rodents up to, like I said before, even things up to kangaroo size, though it doesn't happen all that often, it can still happen. Habitat degradation is more associated with rabbits. So they're selective grazing and overgrazing. That leads to ground disturbance and erosion, and that erosion or that soil then's washed into the waterways, causes turbidity and all sorts of things there. And ultimately degrades the water quality. They disperse weeds as well. Both of them do in their fur. But even just the way they disturb the soil creates weed dispersal. Competition for food, water, and shelter is the other thing that both of these species do, and that's competition with native species for those particularly important resources. And both of them can also transmit diseases, exotic and endemic diseases. So at least 14 native species of birds and 48 mammals, 12 reptiles and 2 amphibians are threatened by predation of foxes under the Environment Protection Biodiversity Conservation Act, and at least 304 species or Australian threatened species are at risk by competition and land degradation by rabbits. So foxes, it's all animals, but within the rabbits, 304 threatened species is also plants. So you can see little orchids there down at the right, and even bandicoots and other things. So, and both of these species, foxes and rabbits, have been implicated in the extinction of many native Australian species. So a bit about agricultural damage. So harassment and predation of livestock is a big thing for foxes. Rabbits and foxes damage infrastructure. So they'll dig under fences and cause damage there. But even just the erosion and everything else can lead to issues that they, with their digging and overgrazing. They'll destroy and consume crops. So you can see down there at the bottom left image, where rabbits have got a warren on the fence line there, and they come out each night to graze in the crop and pretty much left it bare. They'll contaminate water sources as well, largely through erosion and runoff. Like I said before, same with environment in agriculture as well. They also compete for food, water and shelter, but that's with livestock. So compete with sheep and cattle for grass and those sorts of things. And again, they'll transmit diseases. So particularly foxes here is the big risk is rabies. If rabies was ever to get into the country, then foxes would certainly be a major vector of that disease. Then there's social impacts as well. So these animals can impact the quality or way of life. So foxes killing people's chickens and severely damaging, or rabbits severely damaging large areas of pasture and reducing the amount of stock that people can carry, can cause emotional stress and anxiety and those sorts of things. They can also damage cultural and historic sites. So the overgrazing by rabbits in particular can lead to wind erosion and those sorts of things, and that can expose culturally significant areas, and that they can be damaged by that over time. They can also cause conflict within communities as well. So abundant populations of these species on certain properties can cause trouble among neighbours and those sorts of things. But on the flip side, they can also be a bit of a resource, particularly foxes as a hunting resource and for their skins, and rabbits as a hunting resource as well, but also for their meat. So fox control, so I'll talk about the control techniques separately because they are a bit different for each animal. And then I'll go into the final bit where we talk about putting together a strategic program. So baiting is probably one of the major ones that's used for foxes, and it's generally used with either a meat bait or a liver bait or manufactured baits. So the manufactured baits are the ones that are bought from chem suppliers or chemical manufacturers. There's 2 toxins that are registered to use on foxes in Victoria, and that's 1080 and PAPP. Best results are achieved when alternate feed is scarce. So you want the foxes to eat what you're offering them, and they're more likely to do that when there's not a lot of other feed around. It's also better if it's undertaken on a regular basis to ensure that the numbers are kept low, and that when the numbers start to, or you prevent them from building up essentially. And your baits want to be replaced too when they're taken, because there can be more than one animal living in a particular area. So it's important to check your bait stations. And just down the bottom right-hand side, well, over the two images are a bait station there. So what you do is essentially bury the baits, and there's rules and regulations around this, and you can look at those on the label for these bait products, but also for the directions of use of PAPP and 1080 bait products in Victoria. So they're another document to look at, but essentially the bait's buried, smoothed over, and you leave a sand pad around it, and you can see the tracks of the fox that's come along and eaten that. And it's hard to make it out in that bottom photo, but that's what's happened there, and you can see quite clearly that foxes have been there. Positives, it's good for broadacre knockdown, and it's quite cost effective. The negatives are that non-target species potentially at risk there if they happen to eat a bait. Canid pest ejectors are another thing that's come out relatively recently. They were essentially designed to manage coyotes over in the United States, but over time they've been adapted and trialled and modified to suit Australian conditions, and they're used now to bait foxes and wild dogs. So essentially they're a spring activated device that delivers toxins directly into the mouth of the fox. So this is a cross section here. So essentially that would be the ground surface. This would all be below ground. This would be above ground. And this above ground component is essentially just a meat lure. And the capsule sits in the middle, which you can see there. And it's a spring loaded piston that fires up through into the capsule, stops at the end there. As you can see, the piston stops there, but that's enough pressure to pop the toxin out into the mouth of the animal. And this thing requires a certain pull force to be triggered, and it requires a pull force in an upward motion, which is often achieved by foxes and by dogs. And it delivers, like I say, the dose directly into the mouth of the animal. Best results are achieved when they're well maintained, so oiled and looked after, so that they work when they're supposed to. When attractive lure heads are used, so they tend to have either kangaroo meat, which are bought, but you can make your own as well with lamb or whatever, and they're dried onto a lure head. And when they're positioned at areas for regular use by foxes, so these things can't be moved around like baits can. So the caching becomes less of an issue with these. So like I say, that's a positive. It can't be cached. The trials have indicated that they're highly target specific. Dogs are an issue, so domestic dogs can also pull these. So certainly that they have to be considered, and all the regulations and everything on the label can be looked at, and to try and reduce any of that. Negatives. They're a bit expensive to buy, but once you have them, then you really only need to replace the lure heads and the capsules, because the CPE itself lasts quite a while. So just talking about 1080, 1080 is one of the toxins that can be used. It occurs naturally in some plants in Australia. So this means that some of our native species have a level of resistance to 1080. Foxes are very sensitive because they haven't evolved in our landscape, and we have a long history of use of 1080. It's difficult to detect in a bait for the animals, so bait shyness is rarely an issue. It breaks down rapidly in the soil by microbial breakdown. Essentially it blocks energy production, and then that leads to major organ failure, so shutdown of the heart and the brain. And death generally occurs in foxes within 3 to 4 hours. So this little table over to the side here just talks about a Canid pest ejector capsule contains 3 milligrams of 1080, and so does a fox bait. And this sort of suggests how many baits it would take for a lethal dose. So possums would need 2. Goannas, you can see, are fairly resistant to 1080, and they would need to eat 93 3 milligram baits. Wedge-tailed eagles are also fairly resistant to 1080, 10 baits in one go. But you can see cats, foxes, and dogs are very sensitive. The other toxin that I spoke about was PAPP, and this is a relatively new toxin that's been developed and to provide additional options for landholders. Death is a bit faster with PAPP, and it works by reducing the blood's ability to carry oxygen throughout the body. So it does that by inducing methemoglobinemia, and that's where the PAPP oxidizes hemoglobin and turns it into methemoglobin. Methemoglobin can't carry oxygen. So like I say, it works by causing major organ failure again, heart and brain. The symptoms are only 30 minutes long, breaks down quickly in the environment, low secondary poisoning risk as well. So that's where other animals would eat a fox. They'd be at low risk. Animals can return back to relative normal if they do not eat the lethal dose, because it requires a pulse dose essentially, and they need to get to a certain point, otherwise they'll just recover. And technically there's an antidote available for this toxin as well, though because it works so fast, actually accessing it in time may be an issue. Ground shooting is another thing that we use or is used for foxes. Stalking and whistling people do, spotlighting, fox drives, and night vision scopes and thermal scopes now. Best results are achieved when undertaken by experienced shooters, and also when the population's already stressed. So it's not a great method for population level knockdowns, but it's good for reducing, problem animals, I guess you could say. And it is humane if it's done properly. But yeah, like it is quite a labor intensive exercise. Fumigation is another one that can be used for foxes. Denko fume is the toxin that's used, and it's a gas, produces carbon monoxide, these cartridges. It's good for localized problems. Often used when the foxes are using the dens during the breeding season. But it's best used when the cubs are older than 4 weeks, because they're born with a survival or an ability to survive with low oxygen levels by being in the womb and then in the den early in their life. So if they're exposed to a denko fume earlier than that 4 weeks, then they may survive. Positives is good for controlling cubs and the mothers while they're in the den. Death is rapid and humane. It's caused by hypoxia. Negatives, it's time consuming, labor intensive, and it can be dangerous to the operator as well, or if there are other animals in the den and not foxes. So it's important to make sure that foxes are the ones using the den. Again, with all chemicals and everything else, you must have the appropriate authorization and also use it according to the label. Trapping is also used. Padded jaw traps can be used for foxes in Victoria and cage traps. There are rules and regulations around their use. They can be looked at or found on the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals Act and their associated regulations. Best used when high quality traps are used with good lures. Traps are positioned near the fresh activity as well. Generally, it's a very labor intensive thing. It's very hard to trap a fox in a cage trap. It can take a very long time. There's humaneness issues as well associated, particularly with foothold traps. And foxes can be neophobic. So it's probably not something you'd go to right away, that's for sure, but it can have its use in certain situations. Fencing is another thing, particularly we use it now around large areas of habitat to prevent predators getting in. The best fence has got to be tall, made of mesh, and have the skirts. The overhang is really important as well at the top to prevent foxes and cats and things from climbing in. It also helps if they have electric wires associated with them and that they're checked on a regular basis. Otherwise, foxes can certainly dig under, or if a tree falls on the fence and those sorts of things, it's quickly breached. They can be good for high value resource protection, but they are expensive and maintenance is high. Guardian animals are another thing that are used in some situations where lethal control is not suitable. They can use dogs So maremas generally, alpacas are another one, and donkeys. And that's generally, they're used to protect the livestock from foxes and sometimes wild dogs as well. They're effective when the bonding process is done properly. Doesn't always work, but when it does work, it can be quite a useful method. Owners should avoid spending too much time with the guardian animals, or they start to forget what their job is and they become more of a pet. Some of the positives, there's low non-target risk, and it can be good in those fringe areas, so peri-urban areas. Good guardian animals are hard to find, and they don't really impact the fox population. They just scare the foxes away from the livestock. So it sort of just moves the problem on, essentially. So rabbit control, we have a bunch of different things to talk about here, and I'll try and get through them as quickly as I can because I don't want to take up all of your time. But essentially, we'll talk about biocontrols, which the first one was Myxomatosis. It was released in the 1950s, and it had a massive impact on the rabbit population. It's spread by biting insects, so fleas and mosquitoes, and also through direct contact with one another in the warrens and those sorts of things. So initially, it had over a 90% knockdown in some areas. Signs of myxo, probably all seen it, the lesions around the eyes, nose and ears. They're lethargic and they develop a fever and loss of appetite, and that leads to death ultimately. Positives, it can cause large population knockdowns. It's already in the environment. So that's probably another thing, and it spreads by itself. But negatives, rabbits that survive are immune for life. It's inhumane, essentially, and they're building a genetic resistance to that. So it's becoming less and less effective over time, as with most diseases and viruses. So the other ones that we talk about is calicivirus, or RHDV. There's been a number of strains. So the first one was released in Victoria or in Australia in 1996, and that was very successful in a lot of areas, particularly in drier climates. But we found that there was a benign strain that was already present in Australia that was providing rabbits in wetter climates with a level of resistance to the Czech strain. So a large search was undertaken in about 2009 or starting thereabouts to find a strain of the virus, RHDV, that could overcome that resistance and impact rabbits in those wetter climates. And they found that K5, or a strain from Korea, was the one that could do that. And that was released in 2017 with average population knockdowns of around about 35%. And you can buy that and release that into rabbit populations at the moment. Also during this time, we found that there was a rogue strain of the virus, RHDV2, that was just appeared. Nobody knows really where or how, but this virus is actually quite lethal to rabbits and has caused considerable rabbit knockdowns. There's a national monitoring program underway, and it seems to be the most dominant strain in the landscape, and it's responsible for 50 to 60% population reductions. Signs of RHDV, so there's short struggles, laying on their side, and a bit of paddling. Internally, there's discolored liver, swollen spleen, and internal lesions. So it works on the blood, essentially. So that's what RHDV is. Hemorrhagic disease, so internal bleeding, essentially. Positives is it's spread by biting and scavenging insects. So, but more so scavenging insects. So they'll get flies and things will get around the eyes of the animal and get the disease from the mucous membranes, and they'll spread that by putting fly spots on the grass. So that's where the flies vomit it up, and the rabbit will eat that grass and then become infected. It's also through direct contact as well. It is essentially safe for non-target species. RHDV2 has been found to affect hares, but all the others are only rabbit specific. Again, genetic resistance is an issue. Rabbits become resistant to things over time. And the K5, that rarely moves past the release site, so it works more as a biocide. So it's put on carrots, rabbits eat it, and then they get RHDV K1, so the K5, but it's not spread much really at all from those particular areas. Here's a bit of a graphic to show a bit of a history of biocontrol. So you can see here Myxo in the 50s dropped rabbits right down, and then they started to build a resistance, and then again they got hit with RHDVZ, which was the Korean strain, and that dropped it right down again. And then back up here in around 2017 when they released the Czech strain. So baiting for rabbits, carrots and oats are the main things that are used, and for rabbits, 1080 and Pindone. Again, there's restrictions around their use, so always be mindful of that. Best results are achieved when alternate feed is scarce, same as the foxes. You just want to bait when there's not a lot of other feed around, so that they're more likely to eat your bait. Free feeding is really important for rabbits, not as important for foxes, but rabbits are a bit neophobic, so you want them to get used to the bait before you put the toxin out. Free feeding also helps you to work out how much toxic bait you might need and where those rabbits are actively feeding. So it's a really important step. Some of the positives, it's good for initial population reductions, and it's cost effective over large areas. Negatives, potentially some non-target species may be at risk, and populations can quickly recover because we're not impacting the warren system. So I won't go into the 1080 too much because it's essentially the same as what we spoke about a little bit earlier with foxes, that it occurs naturally. Rabbits are very sensitive. Some of our natives are less sensitive. Yeah, death occurs the same within about 3 to 4 hours in rabbits. So Pindone is a different one. That's an anticoagulant, and that works on the blood. It affects the clotting ability of the blood and blocks vitamin K cycle. It's a cumulative toxin, unlike 1080, which is an acute toxin. So this means that a cumulative toxin needs to be given over repeat doses, and it's best if those doses are spaced apart as well. So generally, to poison, you would do three separate occasions and space each one by about 2 to 3 days apart. There's a bit of a delayed onset to symptoms, so that means that the beta version is generally not an issue with Pindone, and there is an antidote with K1. The other thing is that some native species can be quite sensitive to Pindone. Warren ripping. So we've probably all heard a bit about that, but this is one of the keys to rabbit control. So you rip their warren and they have a really hard time to survive after that, because the warren provides them with protection from predators and the weather and everything else. So ripping is generally done with an excavator or a bulldozer, and it's where you completely destroy the warren system with the tines on the back. Cross ripping is best. Yeah, best results are achieved when the soil is friable after the population decline. So after you've done some baiting, using large heavy duty machinery, ripping to a depth of 600 millimeters or greater and 4 meters beyond the warren, and cross ripping is the way to go. Positives, it's the single most effective option for providing long-term control. It's a big upfront cost, and it may impact cultural sites and other sensitive areas. So it's important to consider all of that if designing a ripping program. Harbour removal is the other thing. So there was the ripping, which gets rid of the warrens, which is harbour, but then there's the surface harbour. So that provides shelter on above ground. So that's things like woody weeds, gorse, blackberry, and boxthorn are pretty common, but also rubbish piles and wood piles and those sorts of things. Rabbits can survive in those. It also provides them with protection to start to dig their own warren system underneath, because it takes a while to dig a warren, but if they've got above like ground shelter, they can dig there and they're not exposed to raptors and things like that, birds of prey. Best results are achieved when undertaken with other forms of control. Positives, it forces rabbits below ground for a start, reduces the chances of new warrens being built. It removes easy shelter for the rabbits. Can be time consuming, can be difficult in some situations, and obviously some harbour may not be able to be removed because it could be native vegetation or whatever. Fumigation is another one. So we did it for foxes. It's also possible for rabbits, but it's different type of fumigant that's used. So it's not carbon monoxide here. For rabbits, it's chloropicarin or it's aluminium phosphide. So chloropicarin is used with a pressure fumigator, and aluminium phosphide are the phosphine gas tablets that are put in the warren systems. So chloropicarin is used, yeah, with a pressure fumigator that pushes the gas throughout the warren system, and aluminium phosphide is put in each entrance, and that sort of naturally goes through the warren by itself. With both, it's still important to use a smoking device. So that's the one in the image there. So you force smoke throughout the warren, and you can see where all the pop holes and air holes and those sorts of things are. And they can be quickly plugged up to make sure that the gas stays in the warren, and so do the rabbits. Best used when the soil is moist as well. So that prevents the gas from escaping. Can be used in hard to reach burrows, good follow-up for ripping. So when you've ripped an area, often rabbit or warrens will reopen, and you can fumigate those warrens. It's labor intensive, and non-target animals might be at risk if they were happening to use a warren at that particular time. So it's important to confirm that it is rabbits that are using that, and just by looking for signs and those things. Fencing, again, is another important one for rabbits. The fences they're not the same, don't need to be as high as they do for foxes, but still important. Again, they're good for protecting high value areas for conservation, agriculture, or plantations. Should be made from wire, because rabbits will chew through plastic. The mesh size, it should be less than 40 mil, so they can't squeeze through, and it should be higher than 900 mil, so they can't jump over. And it's also good if the fence has an apron. So rabbits will often go to the fence and dig down, and if there's an apron coming out, they'll just dig into the wire there. Useful in urban environments, good when it's used with other techniques. But you've got to make sure that you control what's on the inside of the fence as well. Gates and waterways can be weak points for sure. And they can be expensive and require lots of maintenance.
Sorry, Jason. We've got someone who's come off mute. If you can please just check your microphones and put yourself back on mute, that would be greatly appreciated. Thank you.
Thanks, Julia. Not too long to go now, so everyone can take off soon, hopefully, and enjoy the rest of their night. But trapping is another one for rabbits. So you can use foothold traps, but there's, again, specifics around that, and they can be found in the PAPP regulations. But essentially, they need to be rubber-jawed traps, and they need to be of a certain design. So if doing rabbit trapping, and they can only be used in certain areas as well. So all of that stuff's important to check before using it. Confinement traps are the others, so those cage sort of style traps down the bottom that can be placed in the warren entrance. Again, they're very labor intensive, so only really good to use or useful in when populations are low, or for removing nuisance animals in sort of built up areas or something. That's with the cage traps, but with the foothold traps, obviously not. Positives can be useful when all other techniques fail, good for small isolated populations potentially. Time consuming and doesn't deal with the warren. So again, you can remove the rabbits, but if you've left the warren system there, more rabbits will come back in no time. They'll reinvade from other areas and breed up quickly. Monitoring, this is really important to do as part of strategic management, and it's important to do before and after control to get an idea of where the animals are, how many are there, and where you might be doing certain controls and those sorts of things. So spotlight counting is often a good one to do because it's pretty simple. You just use a 4x4 and a standard spotlight. Best results are achieved when it's used in relatively open country so that you can see the animals, and that the techniques are standardized so you can compare apples with apples essentially. So you want to do it the same time of the year over a certain number of nights with the same observers and over the same country, and to see whether your program is working. It's good because rabbits and foxes are mostly nocturnal. Like I said, it's pretty simple and accessible, and both species have pretty bright eye shine, so they're easy to detect. Negatives, it's a bit hard in dense veg and not suitable in extreme weather conditions. Camera trapping is another one that's been used a fair bit these days. Really good for foxes. Can also be used for rabbits. You can place cameras on warren systems and set your cameras for a time delay so the rabbits don't necessarily have to trigger the camera with movement. It just takes a photo. Different types can be used, so you can use video camera or still. You can work out activity or abundance measures with it. And they're also great for assisting with control. So working out where animals are or how they're interacting with your control techniques and those sorts of things. Positives, it's pretty cost effective for collecting data. It's analyzing that takes a long time, so you can get lots of images and it's pretty time consuming. But yeah, collecting the data is quite easy. You can monitor a whole range of things at once. So you can monitor potentially rabbits and foxes at the same time, or you can monitor your native species as well. But the cameras are a bit expensive to purchase. Track plots are another thing, generally mainly used for foxes. So essentially this is where you scrape a rake across the road every 500 or so meters with a width of about 1 meter. You have a set number of plots along particular tracks in an area, and the next day you come back and look at the number of fox passes along those areas. You can create an index of abundance here and repeat. It's best when repeat measures are undertaken. So you generally do 3 nights in a row or so at a certain time of the year and compare that again at other times of the year. Pretty labor intensive, pretty time consuming. It is impacted by the weather as well. So you can set up all your plots on one day and then you get rain that night and ruins everything. So generally more of a one that's used often more in research and those sorts of things, where there's a bit of time and to be able to do something like that. Warrant assessments is another thing that's quite good as well. You can get out there and count the number of active entrances, GPS or your warrant system. So rip them first and then see what comes up afterwards. It's pretty cheap and easy and can be used pretty well anywhere. So again, it's just really an observational type of assessment. So the strategic management, we're just down to the last little bit now. But yeah, essentially, traditionally, a lot of management was pretty reactive. So you'd see something wrong, like with damage, and go, I need to fix that. And generally, the only tool, the one tool would be used, and often that was shooting. And like we've found over the years, shooting is really quite an ineffective technique for population level control. Useful as part of an integrated program, but as the only technique, it's just too hard to keep the numbers low with animals like rabbits and foxes. Timing's generally poor, so when you're doing the control, it's probably not the best time for it because it's reactive to the damage. The damage is already happening. It's undertaken generally at a property scale, which means that reinvasion happens pretty quickly as well from next door neighbours and the like. Little monitoring's undertaken before and after, so we don't really know what was there and what we've got left. And there was a real focus on the number of animals killed, but not knowing like what that actually means in terms of population reduction. So, killing 100 rabbits on your property might sound good, but it might not be that good if there's 1,000 out there. And the aim was often to eradicate as well. And here's a slide on the rules for eradication. And what we said earlier, these animals are often established because they're abundant and widespread. We can't stop them from moving back in. So the rules for eradication generally are, you can remove them faster than they can replace themselves. You can prevent reinvasion from outside areas, and you can ensure that all reproductive animals are at risk of the control technique. Desirable rules as well, so things that also help with eradication. They can be detected at low densities. So a lot of animals, once they get to low density, it's hard to find them, particularly things like foxes. So you don't know when you've eradicated them or not. The cost benefit of eradication outweighs continued management, and the socio-political environment allows for it. So, in some situations, total eradication, there'd be people pretty upset with certain pests if they were eradicated. One that's often thought about is, say, pigs, feral pigs, for example. They're a popular hunting animal. If they were all gone, then there'd be a few people out there that might be upset about that. So modern management has looked at things a little bit differently. There's a few key points to it, and it's identifying and working with all the key stakeholders, so everybody has a say and feels like they're a part of the program. Understanding the biology and behaviour of the animals is really critical. So knowing when to implement your controls and where. using the right control techniques as well. So they won't always suit all areas and they won't always suit all situations. So identifying what works for you and your situation. Looking at the best and the latest information. So there's a lot of places now you can go to find that, which is really good, really helpful. And you can talk to people as well who have been there and done that. Make an evidence-based decision. So that's all about your monitoring. So, you know, making changes based on actual evidence. Adopting the strategic approach to management, aiming to reduce the damage. So that's asset-based protection, essentially, rather than eradication. Coordinating your efforts at a landscape scale and using a suitable monitoring strategy. So the strategic approach that I mentioned, this is what's often used to develop a program. So firstly, you define what the problem is. So what was potentially the trigger for management? And it's not necessarily the pest itself. It could be, you know, in this example, like the platypus numbers are declining. And foxes could be an issue there. So to determine that, you'd need to do some form of monitoring. But essentially, you define what a problem is. So in an agricultural setting, it could be lambing rates are down, not foxes are there. So it's working out what the actual problem is. Determine clear and measurable objectives so that you can see whether you're meeting them over time. Developing a detailed plan of action. Undertaking your risk analysis first. So that's thinking about if I use baiting or shooting or trapping, what's the risk? Thinking about money risks as well. So over investing in certain things. So going through that, implementing the plan, monitoring and evaluating, and then refining things over time. So refining, say, management costs or improving efficacy and those sorts of things. And that's referred to as adaptive management. So this is the last slide, and this is the one that's essentially used for rabbits. And I haven't done one for foxes, but essentially with the rabbits, you assess the problem, you develop the plan, reduce the numbers. So this has been done over many years. They call it the rabbit recipe. That it's the best way, if you can do it, to reduce rabbit numbers. We don't have that luxury for all pest animal species, but for rabbits, there has been a lot of work go into it to figure out what is the best approach. So yeah, reducing the numbers first, then ripping and removing the surface harbour, monitoring to fumigate any reopenings, and then just continually assess and going around that circle is essentially what we do. That's the end. So yeah, there's plenty of good information on our website. If you wanted to, because I've gone through a fair bit tonight, so people probably won't take it all away, but there's some good information on all the different management techniques and biology and ecology and everything on the website. Pest Smart is another one that's a really good website, and it's got heaps of information on pest animals. And there was a video series actually that happened a little while back on the ABC that talks about some of these pest animals and their impacts, and they were quite interesting to watch as well for a little bit more info. But essentially that is it. So I'm more than happy to take questions or anything, and sorry if I've gone over time, but hopefully that's not too bad.
No, it's good. Thanks, Jason. So yeah, as I mentioned earlier, if you've got any questions, please pop them in the chat and I'll ask away. We've got a couple there. The first one's from me, so I'll kickstart it.
Sure, no worries.
Are there any biological control options for foxes?
No, there's not in Australia at the moment. Yeah, and I don't know why that is actually. There's just something that haven't really been looked into. Potentially, they've looked into things like fertility control or anti-fertility, but that technology is not there yet. So there's no one-shot oral dose that's species specific to, say, foxes that will prevent them from having young for their entire life. So that's kind of where those things are at the moment.
Okay, great. Got another one here. Is climate change expected to have a positive or negative impact on fox or rabbit populations? That's
pretty difficult one to answer, to be honest. But I guess with pest animal species being so adaptive, I would expect they would adapt their behaviour to suit whatever the climate is. That's why they've been so successful. That's why they've been able to colonize the deserts in Central Australia right through the coastal areas. So I expect as the temperatures change, the rabbits and the foxes will adapt with it.
Okay, great. Another question here from Linda. What's the best cameras for monitoring?
Good question. And it sort of depends on what it is that you're trying to monitor, because there's a whole range of different cameras out there on the market. And if it's just simple stuff like presence, absence, and those sorts of things, some of the cheaper ones can be just fine. But if you're trying to really analyze animal behavior and try and capture all of that information, then some of the higher end cameras that have slower time delays, or sorry, quicker shots or video is better, because some of the cheap ones have a long delay, so it might be a second or 2 seconds between photos, and a lot can happen in that time. But to simply just detect if you've got rabbits or you've got foxes, those cheaper ones are fine. But behavioral stuff, you might need to spend a little more.
Thanks. Another question here from Julia, not me, different Julia.
Yep.
How effective is the rabbit vaccine for calcium, and how regularly is it needed?
Oh, so for calicivirus.
I think it's meant to be calici.
Yep. So it's effective for the RHDV1K5. So that's the Korean strain of the virus, which is released on intentionally. So it's effective against that. It's also effective against the virus that was released back in 1996, which was the Czech strain of the virus. Its effectiveness against RHDV2, which is that one that came from nowhere, that's a little bit, we're not quite sure where it came from. It's a bit limited with that. So people still do vaccinate for RHDV2, and it's a good thing to do that. But what you want to do is also keep your rabbits away from wild rabbits so that they don't have any interaction. And if you're really concerned as well, it's that the RHDV2 is essentially being spread by blowflies and flies and things like that. So keeping those away from your rabbits if you can, and giving them, feed that's from pet shops or whatever, rather than grass that could actually be contaminated with that virus somehow. But using the vaccine is the way to go. But there's no 100% guarantees with RHDV2.
Thanks, Jason. Another one here from Graham. We're considering floating islands as a safe location for turtles to nest. How far from the bank would you expect foxes to swim for a feed?
Good question as well. They're pretty cunning, foxes, that's for sure. So I think they would figure out a way to get over there onto the island. Like I wouldn't say for sure, but I think that it's certainly a possibility, because foxes just tend to turn up on islands as well. So they're on a lot of islands where we have penguins and those sorts of things, and they cause a lot of issues. So I would suggest that a fox would probably figure out how to get over there. I don't know how far they can swim, but I expect they can swim a reasonable distance.
No worries. Another question here from Nicole. I can't rip the ground and I am in an area filled with wildlife. Which rabbit bait would be best to keep the numbers down?
That's a difficult question as well. So if there's wildlife and potential risks there, so obviously for using toxicants, you would need to, there's some accreditation that needs to happen. But I'd have a look at the website in that situation. But a potential option, if there's too much risk to non-target species, then it may be an opportunity to potentially fumigate the warrens. If there wasn't any native animals in them, you might be able to look at potentially using the virus, so RHDV K5, that might help as well. So there's a few different options. So I'd just have do a bit of research on the website and that sort of thing.
I think sometimes the techniques that we recommend in those instances can also include ferreting and netting as well, or using dogs. I don't know if you've had or if you've got any opinions on that or any information, but it's definitely something that we've used around Nillumbik before.
Yeah, I'm sure it can work, but again, like the big thing that's always there is if the warren's there, then they've got a house to come back to, and it doesn't take long. Like, remember that image that we had of 2 rabbits can equal, I think it was 186 rabbits in 18 months. So they can come back very quick. So the best bet is to remove the warren. Otherwise, you're just going to be doing that all the time. You know, it's going to be a very labor intensive method for reducing numbers, but it can be used as well. So ferreting can be used, but often in conjunction with other things.
Yeah. Thanks. Another question here from Graham. Is there any type of cattle grid that works for foxes?
I'm not sure about that one, but I reckon, well, like if there was a, I'm just assuming that Graham might be talking about if there was a predator-proof fence, because otherwise, the foxes are just going to jump your fences and that sort of thing anyway, and it's pretty hard to keep foxes out. They're very persistent animals, and they often find a way to get over. But I'm not aware of any cattle grid that would stop a fox from getting through.
No worries. Julia was just saying thank you to your answer about the calicivirus, but she said, just FYI, it is probably effective against RHDVZ, but we've lost a lot and had tested, and since then we have vaccinated and not lost any. I haven't vaccinated for a couple of years and not lost any, but of course don't know how much RHDVZ is around now.
Yep. Yeah, and it sort of ebbs and flows with seasonal conditions and all sorts of things. But no, thanks for that information. And there is a little bit more info, probably more detailed info on the website as well, around the use of vaccines and those sorts of things.
No worries. There's no more questions in the chat, but I do have one more regarding the Canid pest injector. How expensive are they?
Good question. So I think Animal Control Technologies, are the ones who supply those, and this is just guessing that they might be around about $80 or something per unit. But I don't know for certain. So yeah, don't quote me on that. But it'll be worth just Googling who the manufacturer is and giving them a call. But I wouldn't have thought they'd be much more than that. I think they're around about that, and quite a useful tool for sure. Because they have been used in a lot of areas where there's potentially risk to natives, and the ways that foxes bite on the lure head, they sort of put their mouth over the top and pull it in an upward motion, and that directly puts the toxin into the mouth. A lot of native animals will like pull on it from the side, and it doesn't actually fire the ejector either. So yeah, and you can load it with non-toxic things first if you're concerned, to put them out and just see what's going to happen, and put a camera on it, and if it looks like it's just foxes, then you're good to go. Fascinating.
All right, thanks. I think that's all for the questions. There's nothing else in the chat, so we might leave it at that. So thank you so much, Jason, for the very informative presentation tonight, and we greatly appreciate you sharing your knowledge and the ways in which we can tackle this really important issue. Actually, before we finish off, I do have one very last question, so I hope you don't mind.
No.
Creek lines and banks, because obviously we're trying to link it back to the platypus. What, in your opinion, would be the best technique for control for both foxes and for rabbits as well?
Again, areas? It's really quite difficult to say for sure without seeing the site, but it's important to remember around creek lines and river systems that there are some rules and regulations around culturally sensitive sites, but also environmentally sensitive areas as well. So that may or may not impact whether you can rip or not in certain places. So, you know, if you're not able to rip, then there's other things that you can do potentially, like fumigation or potentially baiting and those sorts of things as well. But yeah, it can be complicated in those areas, and it does take a bit of work to make sure that, you know, everything's going to be done in the right way. We're not going to cause more harm than good, I suppose.
Yeah. Thank you.
No worries.
Well, that concludes tonight's webinar. So I'm just going to do a bit of cross promotion. So thank you again, Jason, for this evening. We have another webinar to follow up on this series tomorrow night at 7 p.m. as well on native freshwater fish species. So tune in if you haven't already signed up to that, please do. And on Wednesday night, we have another presentation on water bugs and the great nutritious value water bugs have for platypus. In addition to that as well, we also have, as I mentioned earlier, the self-guided bike tour along the Diamond Creek Trail for the platypus. And finally, the festival will wrap up with a family fun day at Edendale Farm. And that will include guest speakers, activities and music on the 30th of May. So please check out our website for more details, and the link is in the chat for the registrations as well. So thank you again, everyone. And yep, concludes tonight's webinar. So thank you all and have a good evening. Bye.
No worries.
Thanks a lot, Julia. Thanks, Jason.
See ya.
Much appreciated.
No worries.
See you later.
Bye.
See you guys later.